So for this week, I'm going to go over the prompts that we were given, which were the same as last week. The first one is what terms were most important in this week's lesson. And the first one that I thought was most important was social vulnerability, which if I were to define that myself, I would probably say social vulnerability to disaster would be like a group or a community that is more prone to the disaster because of the societal reasons. And one example that I thought of was third world countries can be pretty prone to disaster compared to industrialized countries because they might not have the resources or finances necessary to have prevention methods put in place or to help clean up a disaster after it happens. And another definition that I found in the text as I was reading was vulnerability to environmental hazards means the potential for loss, which is kind of what I was thinking, but put into a more scientific definition. Another important concept that I learned this week was typology of disaster research. So there was an article that I read that was on that. And so it talked about how the purpose of typology is to gain a hazards paradigm that provides a comprehensive and critical and holistic approach. So the different things that they look at when they're using this type of research would be exposure to risk perception, preparedness, behavior, warning, communication and response, physical impacts, psychological impacts, emergency response, recovery, and reconstruction. So I thought that was interesting because it was cool to see how they go about researching disasters. I never really thought about people researching disasters, but it is a thing that is important to do. And another important term is inequality. The text talks a lot about gender inequality when it comes to disasters. And if I were to define inequality in my own terms, I would say it's unequal treatment between groups or individuals, for example, like different races, genders, all of that kind of stuff. So what was my muddiest point? My muddiest point was probably about the disaster and gender statistics that I read in one of the articles. I had never thought about there being statistics on how disasters affect different genders. I thought that was really interesting and something I had never thought about. So, like it was saying was an analysis, they did an analysis of disasters in 141 different countries, and the differences in deaths between male and female what tended to be linked to women's economic and social rights, which I thought was so interesting. I don't really understand it, how a disaster could affect a woman differently because of her social rights. That kind of confused me. And it said that studies show boys and girls and women are 14 times more likely than men to die during a disaster, which I also thought was interesting and also don't really understand why it's different for the different genders or ages, but I thought it was interesting. And so for the last prompt, if I had to lead an in-class, in-person class this week, what's one question I would open a class discussion with? And that's kind of hard. I would probably ask, I would probably talk about social vulnerability and ask if anyone knows what it means, and then ask for examples, like I said, about third world countries, and get the discussion talking about social vulnerability and disaster because, I mean, it's what this lesson is mainly about. And I would probably also ask if anyone has had any experience with disaster or knows any big experiences with disaster in their family or friends, and see if it differentiated between the genders or ages. So yeah.